whenever ready.
Okay. All right, Bill, you want to give us your name and spell it for us, please?
William Gollnick, Gollnick.
And do you have a middle name?
Arthur.
Arthur, okay. And what year were you born?
1950.
And where was the date?
January 13th, 1950.
Okay. And where were you born?
I was born in South Bend, Indiana.
South Bend, Indiana.
Yeah.
All right. Give us the names of your parents and your mother's maiden name.
My mother was Josephine Matoxin Gollnick. She has no middle name. My father was Harold E. Gollnick. Officially, everyone my entire life knew him as Jim.
Now, do you remember any of your grandparents and their names?
Oh, yes. My grandmother was Agnes Skinador Matoxin. My grandfather was Edward Matoxin. And I've had the opportunity to hear stories about them all my life. Edward Matoxin had passed away before I really got to know him. Agnes was someone that I came to know very well.
Tell me a little about her then. I mean, do you know what her educational background might have been?
She went to 3rd grade. She was a very hard worker all of her life. She was the mother of 13 children.
13?
My mother was in the middle of that group. She was actually born in a log cabin on the reservation here, the other end. When my mother was about 5, my grandparents moved to an area around Wittenberg, where my grandfather was then lumberjacking. You know, there were no jobs around here at the time, and there were a number of Oneidas that actually did that. They acquired a perfectly square 24 by 24 house, 4 rooms, no plumbing, no electricity, no much of anything. They did have the convenience of a hand pump in the kitchen, and so they didn't have to tote water. But the house was, that was the homestead. You're familiar with the Wittenberg area, and it's almost all rocks. So whatever crops they planted around the rocks in their pasture. And my grandmother canned absolutely everything, canned potatoes. In the summer it was pigweed salads and grease sandwiches. There was a round table in the kitchen that just had a big cup in the center that was filled with silverware. And because not all of the family could ever sit around the table at the same time, everyone just kind of ate in shifts. And so they would come in and eat and move on and wash dishes, and the next group would sit down. That was kind of a full-day occupation. As I mentioned, my grandfather had passed away before I really got to know him. But that house was always very special to my grandmother. She believed that she could speak to my grandfather when she was there. She would hear him coming the mile from town out to the house and whistling, and they would have grand conversations. The house was an old lath and plaster, and much of the plaster was gone. She was always very conscientious about family, and so there were a lot of family photos in the living room. But she couldn't afford even picture frames, so she used a storm window. And she put the storm window up on the wall and had all the pictures of the family behind the window. That was how she framed them.
Did she work out of the home, or was she mostly a homemaker?
She was mostly a homemaker, as you might imagine, of necessity. My experiences with her, I can recall splitting wood and helping to stoke up the stove in the kitchen, which was the only heat the house had. It was a great big old wooden cook stove, but with just the 4 rooms it would warm it up pretty well. And I remember churning butter and feeding the chickens. I remember this one really kind of unusual thing where my uncles had actually trained the chickens to look up whenever they would whistle. And so the chickens would just be out around the house, and they would whistle, and the chickens would all freeze and immediately look straight up. You know? And they had taught them that because there were chicken hawks out there. And when they would whistle and the chickens would look up, they'd see the hawk, and then they'd all run for the hen house. Of course, my generation came along, and we liked to watch the chickens freeze and look up, so we were whistling all the time. There pretty much went the training. But yeah, my grandmother relied very heavily on what she could grow, what she could can. She would have a cow that she would use for milk until it pretty much dried up, and then it became soup. The chickens were pretty much there as long as they could lay, and then they too became soup. It was just barely eking out an existence. My grandfather actually passed away, I think, a week before they would have been eligible for Social Security. And so the family never really had anything, and so the kids basically chipped in to preserve the house and help their mom out. But she was self-sufficient absolutely as long as she could be. She, like many in our community, but certainly significantly among my relatives personally, had pretty acute diabetes. And by the time she reached her 60s, she was certainly legally blind and virtually completely blind. And she'd had both legs amputated. Having said that, we tried bringing her to where we were then living, which was in Chicago, where we had a single-level ranch-type home that was maneuverable for her at least, and there was plumbing and so on. But she absolutely could not live away from the house. And so we had to take her back up to Wittenberg, and family continued to stay with her. People kind of rotated through and took care of her in her home.
How many, can you give us the names of your aunts and uncles on your mother's side?
I should have probably prepared a list before I came down here. The eldest three were actually by a first marriage. She had been married to a Webster who apparently had been a conductor on a train. And I remember as a child only hearing that he had been killed in a train wreck. But her eldest was Raymond. She had then a daughter named Gertrude, who later died in childbirth with her first child. And then Kaiser were the three Websters. And there's Commodore, Virginia, Delia, Elda. In fact, my grandmother used to be confused with the names of all of her kids. My mother is Josephine, and so my grandmother would yell out the back door whenever she wanted any of the girls to come. She would yell to Dolorsifine, which kind of put everybody all together. All the girls were expected to come when she would do that. There is Lindahl and Earl. And I know I have missed some, but those are the ones that come to mind immediately.
Did your grandmother speak Oneida?
My grandmother only spoke Oneida until, let's see, my mother was going to first grade, and my grandparents were brought into town. This was in Wittenberg. It was a mission school. Because my mother had slipped and had spoken English. They actually locked her in the basement of the school. This was in the middle of winter, and it was an unheated basement. My mother was down there all day and almost froze. And she looked back on it years later and said, well, they probably forgot I was down there or whatever. But my grandparents were brought into town, and they were raked over the coals for teaching their children this pagan language. And my grandmother was particularly crushed by that. She didn't want to see her other kids going through the same thing. And so she decided at that point in her life, while she still only spoke Oneida, that she was never going to speak Oneida in the home again. And it was extremely traumatic. She tried to the best of her ability to only speak English. And she tried that right up until she suffered a stroke toward the end. And as is the case with strokes for many people who are bilingual, depending on what part of the brain is affected, a person that's bilingual will often lose the second language that they learned. And she succumbed to that. So she was at that point in her life on a bed within a year of her death, only able to speak Oneida, and most of her children around her had very limited capacity to speak at that point. which was really very, very tragic. So my mother's memories, I know, related to the fact that some of the people and some of the older Oneidas would love to come out to our house, come out to their house, and they loved to engage in conversations with my mother because she was so fluent. It was so encouraging to them to see a young girl who was so proficient in the language. But then my mother's experience too was one of, as she continued on at school, she was sent away to Flandreau. Coming back from Flandreau, she had a very difficult time, I think, readjusting into the family. She had, I mean, the education process had pretty much succeeded in stripping her of her language, and looking for employment, which was something that was incumbent upon all of her generation at that point, again, to keep the homestead and help take care of their mom. She ended up working, cleaning in a resort in northern Wisconsin. And it was there that she met my father, who had just returned from the Second World War. And the rest, as they say, is history. My father had actually, before the war, built Studebakers in South Bend, Indiana, and had family down there. So that was how I came to be born there. He died when I was only 2 of a cerebral hemorrhage. And my mother moved us to Chicago, where we lived on a block where old Jim Skinador and a whole array of other Oneidas lived on one block, on both sides of the block. So there was a gangway in between, and all of us kids would play there together. So it was that was kind of Oneida too.
What church did your grandmother go to?
She actually went to it was a Lutheran church out there. When they were still back here, she was more aligned with the Methodists.
Okay. Now, did you have an opportunity to spend time with her when she would be talking about, her younger days or things that went on either here or up in Wittenberg? Old stories or things like that.
Yeah.
Do you recall that?
Well, a few. I mean, she would, even though she worked very hard at only speaking English, when the relatives would come over, especially when the kids were around, she would revert to Oneida. So some of those stories were kind of difficult to pick up. But I remember a number of times, and perhaps it drives me to what I do today. As you're very aware, I'm working on land claims issues. And among the things that she had shared with me when I was just a child was the discussion of the land claim and how the United States was going to make that right. And she talked about how her grandmother had actually traveled here, and she recounted the problems that she'd had and the difficulties, and that in some ways, I've thought back on that many times since I've been working on these land claim issues with New York. That maybe it was fate that all these things just came together in a way that I now have the opportunity to try to bring that to closure.
Okay. Let's talk about your mom and dad now. You say your mother went away to school in Flandreau.
Right. She went to Flandreau. They in those days they wore cut-down military uniforms. She would work half a day and go to school half a day. In the summers, they were, through arrangements with local businesses and families, the girls would be expected to find work kind of as, as domestics or seamstresses. They would help with the, with these local families for which they would be paid. But the problem was that since they didn't have the money to travel home, when they went away to school, they were gone essentially for the 4 years of school. And it worked a lot like kind of the old company store. Because they were living there at the school, the purchases that they would make from the school store would have to be paid for by the money that they would earn. So by the time the summer would come around, they had no money to travel with again, and the cycle just continued. The boys were expected to be farm hands or let's see, they were training most of them to be welders or to work in some kind of blue collar field when they completed. But the situation was that they essentially earned enough money to pay off the store and stay even. And when they came back home, then they had been essentially reprogrammed to be something else, and that was something that was really very difficult for my mother, and it was something that was challenging to her as she ultimately was able to reconnect with her siblings when finally she kind of completed working in Chicago and had come back home.
When she came back, what prompted her to go to Chicago?
It was basically employment, and it was and there was family. Jim Skinador was my grandmother's baby brother. He was the youngest of that family.
And he worked in a foundry down there, did he?
He did, and he also was somewhat of a barber. So he was the family barber, kind of like my Uncle Kaiser was the family mechanic, working on vehicles all the time. Our garage always had an old res car in it, and we'd pull engines and transmissions and rebuild them from scratch. He knew how to really put things together in ways that were magical. He always had parts left over, and they always ran. It was amazing. But Jim was there, and his kids, and there were other Oneida families in the immediate area, and I kind of grew up with David and Mario. They were two of his sons. One was just before me, and one was just behind me. So.
Now your dad, now where was he from?
My dad was from South Bend. His father had actually built Studebakers as well, and when he left to go in the service, he entered the Army Air Corps. He was actually very decorated. He was in 2 theaters and had volunteered for the 3rd.
Tell me which ones.
He was in Africa and Europe, and he was volunteering for Japan, or for the Asian theater. He was a bombardier on a B-29. Had experiences that my mother had shared with me. They had the old newspaper clippings and all of his ribbons. But in one episode, he had actually, their bomb string caught on the plane. And so the entire bomb string was hanging beneath them. So obviously they couldn't land, they couldn't do anything. And there was, my father actually hung out beneath the plane with somebody holding his ankles and managed to free the string so that they could land. In another episode over Germany, they were hit with flak, and the only 2 that made it back were the captain and my father. Everybody else on the plane was killed. And I think it was after that my father had volunteered for the 3rd theater, and they sent him up 3 more times, and decided that he had served sufficiently. So brought him back home.
Missions, huh?
Yeah. He has in fact, I still have his flight jacket, and he has on the left side and front, he painted a bomb for each mission he flew, and the entire left side of the jacket is covered. He was quite a person. So
when was he married before or after he went into service?
He was married after.
And he was originally from South Bend?
Yes.
And were they Oneida?
No, he was not.
What was he?
He was German and a little bit of Irish.
I see. Now, he came back from the war. Mm-hmm. Okay, and did your mother ever tell you how she and your father met?
How they met? Well, it was actually that she was working in this resort in northern Wisconsin, and he was working. He had some type of job up there over the summer, and so he was staying in that kind of, well, resort is probably a bit overstated at this point. You know, it's cabins, cottages. Yeah. But she was very curious about him at first, not because of how he looked or anything else. She was curious because on Saturdays, he would leave every time wearing a uniform. And at that point, there was still a lot of question about, spies and all this. So she's wondering, is this guy up to something? Why does he just wear this uniform on weekends? And what else might he be up to? When she came to know him, she found out that they still had discount train fares for servicemen. And so he'd throw on his uniform on Saturday so he could catch the train to go back home. But they had gotten to know each other while he was working there and she was working there. But through their, as they got to know each other, he was obviously quite taken with my mother, and so he lavished her with gifts and took her out to dinner and all of this, and she thought, wow, this is really something. Not only was she in love with this man, but also he was going to be able to provide for her in a way that she'd never had it before. Of course, what she didn't know until later was that he was using all of the money that he'd saved to do all of that. So when they married, they were both broke. And so re-engaging at the Studebaker plant was kind of how they got by.
I see.
Yeah.
And they lived down in South Bend then?
They lived in South Bend. I think they married. It must have been like 1947, maybe. And I did not come along until January of 1950. But then my father was actually out working on a car. He was underneath the car doing something and succumbed to a cerebral hemorrhage. And I guess that's what my mother always called it. And so that stays with me. I think today they would call it an aneurysm. But they took him to the hospital. He was still alive. But the surgical techniques at that point were such that they knew they couldn't bring him through, or if they did, that he wouldn't be himself when that process was over. And I think my mother was left with a decision of, they said it was a 50-50 chance if they operated, and it was probably only a 10% chance if they didn't, but he was more likely to be himself if they didn't. And she knew that he was too strong an individual to accept anything else, so they went with the long odds, and obviously he didn't make it. But I spent time with her there. She, I remember Social Security sent her a letter, and one of the forms that she was supposed to fill out asked how much money I had earned the year before, and I was months old at that point. And she was dealing with grief and a lot of other things, that she just tore it up and threw it away. And so she found a job as a telephone operator, and she'd never done anything like that before. She had never had a car. Most of her relatives didn't in those days. And my father had a vehicle, but had never taught her to drive. And so suddenly, with a newborn, she's trying to figure out how to drive an old Studebaker stick, which meant for a number of interesting adventures as well. But she worked as a telephone operator for quite a while, and then the decision was made that really family is all someplace else, and it was time to move on. So there were still not jobs up here. I mean, I recall, in 1970 when I got back, we still had a 55% unemployment rate, and it was much better then than it had been earlier. So Chicago was a place that she could work, and she worked in a Goldblatt's department store downtown. And we had a little place on the near north side. There were a lot of Indian folks in that neighborhood. We were close to Milwaukee Avenue, and I would often see relatives out there and family friends.
Is that where you started school?
I started school in Chicago, and it was that was a pretty dramatic shift for me.
What year was that?
It was 1956.
Okay.
It was I was going to the school where I was the only Indian kid in the school. Certainly, at least the only Indian kid in the class. There were, I mean, everything was really very foreign to me. They still had corporal punishment in those days, and I remember experiencing that a couple times. But Actually, I was there for first grade, and I was big for my age. When I was young, I was always the biggest kid in my class, and I got into it with older kids that were a couple of grades up, and it was difficult for my mother sometimes too. So there was a period where I was sent off to stay with my paternal grandparents. Was back in South Bend for a bit, and then back to Chicago. And I pretty much concluded my high school years in Chicago. We would use the summers to travel back up here or out to Wittenberg. But for the most part, I was down there. And I was involved in wrestling and made some friends while I was there, and there were a couple of us anyway at the end of the day decided to go in the service in '68. So one of my wrestling buddies and I signed up in May, graduated in June, and went off to the Marine Corps in September of '68.
And how old were you then?
I was 18.
18. Okay, and where did they send you then?
Well, the Corps, this is really interesting. I'd signed up in May, as I said, on what was called the 120-day delay plan. So I had 120 days from the day I signed up until I had to go active. Well, during that period, I'd managed to get 2 moving violations.
2 what?
2 moving violations.
Oh, okay.
So I went to the recruiter, because I didn't have the money to pay for the tickets. So I went to the recruiter and I said, I've got these tickets. Can you, what do I do? Because the court date was coming up after I was due to report. So the recruiter said, don't worry about it. I'll go to court. I'll explain that you're in boot camp and the judge will throw them out. Okay. So I went away to boot camp, did my 10 weeks in San Diego. From there, we reported to infantry training, but they didn't have a unit for us to pick up with, so they put us on mess duty. 3 days into mess duty, one of the guys that I was serving with on the food line was diagnosed with meningitis, which is highly contagious, and that's really not a good thing to be on the food line when you have meningitis. So they pulled us from there, put us in quarantine for 10 days.
For how long? 10
days.
Okay.
So after we were off quarantine, we reported back, and there was a unit picking up that day, and so we started our infantry training. Now, as you know, when you first go in, you're presented with your original orders, which is multiple copies of where it is you're going to go, and all you have to do is look at the back page and you know where you're off to. And mine, the sequence for me was that I was supposed to go through boot to infantry training, to artillery school, to staging, and then to Westpac, which of course in those days meant Vietnam, West Pacific. So I went through boot, went through quarantine, went through infantry training, and reported to artillery school with walking pneumonia. And they had us standing on a grinder on Christmas Eve, as fate would have it. And we were out there for about 2 hours, and I am coughing and wheezing and feeling like I'm going to fall over. But I figured I finally had an opportunity to go to sick bay. I was between training cycles, and that was the time to go. And then this old gunnery sergeant comes out and said, "We decided to change your orders. You're going home on leave." So then I was left with a dilemma of, okay, do I drag my weary body to sick bay, or do I go home on leave on Christmas Eve? So it took me about 2 nanoseconds to drag my body to the airport, and I was on my way home. And among the many things that I did while I was home was go through my mail, only to find that I had bench warrants out for me because my recruiter hadn't been going to court. In fact, he fell in love. He wasn't going to the recruiting office. And as fate would have it, about the time I was going back, he was losing a stripe and going to Nam. But what was interesting about that was that we caught up. A friend had come home on leave at the same time. And we caught up with this recruiter while we were home. And he said the way he would square up with me was to say that the next 2 guys that walked in the door had been recruited by us when we were home on leave. And if you recruited someone in those days, you got a 5-day leave extension. They changed our orders to accommodate the leave. And when we reported back, my friend and I ended up in 2 different training batteries in artillery. But he and two guys in his training unit, and I was the only one in my unit that got sent east. Everybody else went over. When they changed our orders to accommodate the leave, it changed our orders that way as well, which is how it came that I didn't end up in Vietnam. I reported to Lejeune, North Carolina. I was there for about a month, and I was sent TAD to Gitmo, to Guantanamo Bay, and I served out my time primarily in Cuba.
How long of a hitch were you in?
If you were willing in 1968 to enlist in the Marine Corps, probably the one perk associated with that was that they offered a 2-year enlistment program. So I went for 2. I was still very gung-ho, and when I got sent to Lejeune, I actually put in for NAM. When they sent me to Cuba, by the time orders caught up with me, because I'd only gone in for 2 years, I was too short. I didn't have the 13 months left to go over. So, yeah, I finished my time in September of 1970, and started school immediately thereafter.
Okay, you come home. Where'd you go to school?
Well, my with about I had 14 days left in the Marines. I was still in Cuba. The Corps is supposed to have you stateside 15 days prior to getting out for processing. And my commanding officer called me in and said that my stepfather had just passed away. So they could send me home on emergency leave. But if they did that, my duty station would still be Cuba. So I would have to go home on leave, go back down to Cuba, terminate my orders, and then go back to the States and begin processing, which would have meant that I would have gotten out late. And that was not something I wanted to do at that point. So I requested MASS, which, as you know, is basically using a formal military process to go to your CO's CO. And when I did that, everything was all spit and polish, you know, standing at attention and stating my case. My captain hadn't supported it. A light bird hadn't supported it. I requested MASS again, and I got to a full bird. And he invited me in, offered me a chair, asked about the family, and said that he would have another corporal bring my orders up, and they would start the processing, and that I could just go home on leave. I decided to spend not all of my leave time at home, but to come back early to process out and get things done. And when I got back, there wasn't I had 2 days to check in and 2 days to check out, and then it was my last day. So I spent my time going through the motions. I was my stepfather had died in Chicago. My mother was still in Chicago. That was really where I needed to be. So I went back there, started in a community college, Thornton Junior College it was in those days. It was a small school in a pretty tough neighborhood, and you know, the caliber of education was not much, but it was something that was close and convenient and affordable. By virtue of having been in Illinois at the time I signed up, I actually was eligible for an Illinois GI Bill as well as the federal GI Bill, and they would have paid my tuition at a state institution. But the University of Illinois was 40-some thousand students. I had just come out of a couple of years of being a number. I wanted to be a person, you know, and that junior college and being close to family was important to me at that point. I finished a semester, and I was midway through my second semester when my mother injured her back, so she couldn't work. I have a sister who is about 10 years younger than I, and so I pulled out of school, worked for a while, helped out with family, and then when things kind of got normalized again, it was time for me to you know, kind of pursue my own course, which led me to what I always refer to as coming back home. I came back to Oneida, enrolled at UW Green Bay, and pursued my undergrad there. Let's see. I started at this junior college in 1970, and I transferred to GB in '71, I guess it was. It was either the second semester of '70 or '71. It was early on in that decade, anyway. it was a different dynamic. It was a very new school. It had a strong environmental focus, and that was something that connected for me. And also, it was an interesting time in terms of the community and the dynamic. You know, a lot of us were looking to learn more about the traditions and participate in that. And then there were all the political issues that were taking place around us as well. You know, the evolution of AIM and all of that meant that there was a lot of activity. And so I was privileged to be elected to become the chairman of the student organization, which was then called Wakatawe, which is a Menominee word, which meant like a coming together, kind of like a spiritual coming together. And when I first arrived, there were only 16 Indian students on campus, and we devoted our mission to bringing in more Indian students and building our community through education. And in 2 years, we had it up to almost 100 students. And that was done almost entirely by the students, because the university at that point was really not receptive and not doing any recruiting. So it became a very political time as well as a time of learning. And that it was also exciting for us to work with language. We had worked with Sarah Skinador, who was one of my mother's sisters. And Sarah and Shorty had converted their garage so that we could meet and have language lessons in the garage, warmed by kerosene lamps, or with kerosene heaters. It's a wonder we didn't die in there. But language was an active part of what we were hoping to learn, and we were able to develop a relationship with faculty at the university. And certainly with you as well, Gordy, in terms of building a proposal here that resulted in a program that contributed, I think, very significantly early on to the development of curriculum and as well as training of teachers.
Okay, the time frame that we're talking about, Bill, were you married yet?
I was married in 1973.
I see.
Jenny and I met at UW Green Bay in undergrad, and we had talked about AIM a little bit before. We were both involved in the local chapter. We were involved in the student body. I think I mentioned that we had been out recruiting other students and had been quite successful.
Excuse me, what is AIM? You said you're involved in AIM? Mm-hmm. What is that?
The American Indian movement had a lot of different elements to it, I think. That was also the time when Wounded Knee was occurring. There was a lot of controversy in the country. I think what was different about the Green Bay chapter of AIM versus some of the others that were more directly involved was that our role seemed to take much more support, so that we were engaged in raising funds and getting blankets and medical supplies and other kinds of things in support, food and so on, that were then taken out to Wounded Knee. We weren't involved in any of the direct fighting or any of that. It was support for an initiative that was really significant in Indian country at the time.
Okay, can you give us an overview of what AIM was about and what you're talking about supporting Wounded Knee? And what happened to lead up to, and where is Wounded Knee? What was it about?
I think it's maybe best understood within the context of what was going on within the country broadly. Growing up my teen years during the 1960s, there had been a lot of activity primarily in the black community. There was a lot of movement towards civil rights, a lot of rioting, and as I was still in Chicago, I had seen and experienced a fair amount of that. It was an extremely difficult and challenging time. I think about how people look back on leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King now and see him as a very radical voice. But at the time, he was actually a fairly middle-of-the-road voice because there were people much further out than he, like the Black Panthers and others, that really created a much broader spectrum. And in a lot of ways, I think Martin Luther King got heard much more because he was considered by many to be more of a voice of reason than those that were in radical, armed to finding some semblance of justice. In the late 60s, kind of returning to issues around Indian country that had been pretty much forgotten. There was a movement to try to rebuild kind of the formal relationship that should have existed continuously between the federal government and the tribal governments. Indian country also was broadly, I think, there was a lot that was going on that was referred to at the time as pan-Indian. Issues of Indian country, kind of a mixing of cultures, kind of a mixing of ideologies of the various tribes, but defining something that was uniquely American Indian. There was also an incredible amount of poverty on almost all reservations, and deprivation. And the federal government had essentially seemed to just turn a blind eye. That resulted in a lot of unrest within these communities. And the American Indian movement kind of picked up along some of the same lines as many of the more radical movements that existed for serving other groups. It had a strong philosophy that was based kind of in that pan-Indian kind of mentality, and it existed to educate people about what was going on in Indian country. It asserted Indian rights across the country in ways that were very vocal, very visible, and Wounded Knee was probably the prime example for which the organization is remembered. In South Dakota, Indian folks, AIM members, some of them Sioux, some of them not, found their way to the site of the battleground, and essentially took over the territory. It was extremely controversial because there were some in leadership in that community that did not support it, but it had taken on kind of a national tone. And during the period that they were there was a lot of, I think, there was a lot of crisis. First of all, there was a lot of fear, but people were standing up for a position in a way that Indian country hadn't for a very long time. And I think that there was support, particularly among those of my generation, for what it was that they were doing. I mean, I remember coming home from the Corps and being in a club down in Milwaukee, or no, it was in Madison, and this guy was he was a ho chunk, and he was just back from Vietnam, and he was talking about how if every Indian person went out and brought out their guns and took on 100 people, they could have the country back. I mean, it was a time that was almost that radical. It was something that people did not have confidence that the deep problems within the country that existed then could be resolved through conventional means. And so it was an incredibly dynamic time. I think the position that we took, that was intended basically to provide foodstuffs and other support for the people there, was more within the genre of kind of humanitarian aid. It was there to make sure that those people who were inside, everybody knew that at the end of the day there was going to be other problems that they were going to have to face, legal and otherwise. But while they were there mostly in a mission, and that deserved some type of support. And it was also a springboard on many of the college campuses, where people beyond Indian country began to really focus and learn and understand issues. And I think kind of as the Black Panthers had their place where people could then look beyond and begin to, the shock factor of that kind of event gave them the impetus to learn more. I think Wounded Knee did that for Indian country in a way that resulted in a number of things. I think the evolution of programs and a transition in the Nixon administration to returning to Indian country. The Nixon message of 1970, speaking to the era of self-determination, I think was shaped by the fact, in part, that suddenly there was an awareness about American Indians again, and the country did have alternative ways of dealing with it that could include Indian country as part of the solution as well as part of the problem. And so that, you know, the organization has continued from that point to this, but I think in very different ways, and it is no longer the kind of focal point that it was during that period. We've moved much more, I think, into the governmental, and I think it was an incredible time in my life. It was an incredible time for everybody in Indian country, and it helped shape how I looked at things going forward.
Okay, now that's where at UWGB you met Jenny,
right? And
her name is
Genevieve Gollnick, Genevieve Webster Gollnick.
Okay. And yeah. Did you have children?
We do. We have three. Our first daughter was, let's see, we were married in 1973. Our first daughter was about to be born in 1975. And one of my wife's sisters passed away. And she had 7 children, so we took in 3 of those. So we went from no kids to 4 kids overnight in a 2-bedroom trailer. 1 bathroom, all girls. So I was odd man out in almost every sense. As the girls got older and went off on their own, we then had 2 more. So we have a daughter who's now 20 and a son who's 18.
What's their names?
The eldest is Cassandra, and her Indian name is Yagudo Hahe. Then there is Sarah, Goyo Nahawis, and James Lonoalu Hawi.
And do you have any grandchildren?
We have one granddaughter, excuse me, Shanice. Yeah.
How old is she about?
She's 11.
11?
Yeah, it's amazing.
Okay. All right, let's go back to UWGB, and shortly after you got married, you were still working at the school then?
I was working, I had been working with the tribe in planning while an undergrad. And it was there in 71 and 72 that we were trying to get some traction to move the tribe forward. The tribe had received a HUD 701 planning grant, and the chairman, secretary, treasurer of the business committee were hired as planners, and David Cannon was hired because he was trained in surveying. Thank you. Yes, he was a formal surveyor. So he was actually doing surveying of the property as part of that grant, and the others were looking at a whole array of planning approaches. I mean, the irony was that there were no shortage of issues to be addressed. I mean, the community had needs that could be defined just about every way but Sunday. The challenge was that there were no resources available to really begin to realize any kind of movement toward resolving the problems. And there were also issues of the way the tribe held land, because it was trust land. It could not be used for collateral from the perspective of the community. Politically, it was unacceptable to jeopardize any of the land. And legally, it was also a problem because land in trust is held in trust by the United States, so you couldn't use it to generate loans. So the tribe had absolutely no working capital. And so planning was something that was very much needed and very much helpful, I think. But at the time, it really meant virtually nothing because we couldn't move forward.
You couldn't do nothing once you had a plan.
That's right. I mean, plans look really good on the shelves. You can have them bound.
At that time, you talking about the 701 planners.
Right.
those were the only employees of the tribe. Is that correct, or was there more
That's
than that?
right. No, that was it.
And how many were there, and do you remember who they were?
The senior planner, I believe, was then the chairman, Purcell Paulus, and Margaret Dockstader, and Amelia Cornelius.
And Margaret was?
I think she was the secretary. She was either the secretary and Amelia was the treasurer, or vice versa.
Vice versa, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's three.
Right. And then Howard. So
and yourself, were you employed?
I was because I was a student, what I had done was work through a companion HUD opportunity that allowed me to work with the tribe, and I think it was supposed to be 20 hours a week.
So you're not a full-time employee?
No, well, not officially. They always made sure they got their time out of me and then some. But I remember one of the first projects they put me on, we were actually looking at the nursing home. I mean, it was a concept early on that we wanted to address, and at that point, and this kind of connects with language, we recognized that there were a number of elders in the community who were Oneida speakers as their first language. And we recognized that as they were getting on in years, that it would be appropriate for us to develop a site where they could come together, where they could speak the language, where they could be with relatives and family and be comfortable. And so that was one of the initial primary thrusts. Having no resources available to acquire anything, once we identified the need, the first thing that they had me do was develop a series of letters to the Pope, asking that the Vatican restore the land held within the boundaries to the tribe so that we could use that land for the development of the nursing home. We asserted that there was no greater use that the church might have for that land than what we proposed to do. The Pope disagreed. But eventually we were able to acquire Norbert Hill Center and kind of move on from there.
Now, that was in 1970, 71,
yeah.
Somewhere there. There were four employees.
Right.
And everybody else was doing things on a voluntary basis.
Right.
Pretty much.
Right.
All right. 1970. All right. 2004. How many employees do the tribe presently have?
Approximately 3,000 employees.
Okay.
And of those, approximately 1,700 are involved in activities that are primarily service activities, governmental activities, activities totally disrelated from gaming. And the balance are gaming employees.
Okay. Now, can you recollect the role of the council at the time? You've got the chair, vice chair, our chair, secretary, and treasurer working as 701 planners. So, what was the capacity or the role as a council as compared to what it is now then?
Okay. I hope somewhere you have old pictures of the tribal building.
Which one?
Chicago Corners. I mean, it was the focal point for what got done in those days. The little side building that was the multi-purpose room was the meeting room for the business committee. And once a month, they would come together and decide on issues that were very restricted in contrast with what we do today. The issues before us were things like land leases or agricultural leases for tribal members, and that has stayed the same for a very long time. You know, a 25-year lease for $25 renewable, and so on, and really that was the financial base of the tribe. In 1971, the tribe's annual operating budget was in 3 figures. It was less than $1,000.
And what is it now?
It is substantially more than that. I think the annual operations budget is about $80 million.
Okay. All right. Is there anything else that you can think of just off the top of your head in terms of operational situations then?
Oh, I can remember so many things. the evolution of some of the early programs. You know, the CAP office, and I think that, oh geez, CETA, job training programs, and so on. The earliest program that complemented the tribe's efforts, though, I think, was actually Head Start. And Head Start was granted to Great Lakes Intertribal Council. Under the Johnson administration, there was not the strong government-to-government relationship that existed later, but there was a commitment to social change and improvement. And like Great Lakes Intertribal Council was formed, at least in part, because it could then use the numbers of all of the tribes in the state to underscore that we were eligible, that we could utilize the funds and should be eligible to receive funds. And so Great Lakes was the body that was generating grant requests and so on. And Head Start was one of their early successes. So with the money going to Great Lakes, they placed Head Start facilities on all the reservations. And that too in the early days started at the tribal building. I remember, oh goodness, Billy Bolin, the old BIA agent, who also had an office there. And I think his primary function was to attend the monthly meetings of the council to tell us that we didn't have the money to do what we needed to do. He was not in a position to really affect much. He was always there to give counsel, however. I think in 1972, things began to change a little bit with the Indian Education Act, and then significantly in 1975 with the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, as the tribe began to contract for programs at a time that was still very risky. I mean, there were a lot of people that were very concerned about what had happened to the Menominee and other tribes under termination in the policies of the 50s. And it was perceived, I think, that under the Indian Self-Determination Act, where the Congress was going, was to encourage the tribes to contract for all these programs. Then it was going to take the budget, leave the tribe holding the bag, and terminate us that way. Oneida was always on the cutting edge, though, and there was a commitment to proceed forward, and we did so in a way that also covered our flanks by submitting in ways that we assured that if there was ever a reduction, that we would default back into the federal system. And with that kind of framework, we proceeded to contract for virtually everything that we could.
Okay, let's go back to the shed again. You got married, and where did you reside at that time?
We were living in a little two-bedroom trailer. It was on what is now Jonas Circle. Jonas Circle was not there yet, so it was a sand road, kind of behind my uncle's house, Commodore Metoxen's house. And spring and fall, it was always a challenge just to get to it, because the sand would become mud and you'd sink to the axle. But the trailer was something that was, it was our first place. It was something that was very meaningful to us, and we'd put a lot of time into trying to fix up what was basically a pretty old rundown trailer. Yeah. When it was spotted, there was one of the long walls was facing directly to the northwest, and it was all open on that side, so the wind would come whistling at us. And that we could have dealt with, but the trailer was designed with a thermostat that was on the outside wall, on that outside wall. And these trailers had come from Alabama or something. And so by the time they got up here, whatever insulation may have been in the walls at some point had settled toward the bottom. And so you had like a 32nd inch of aluminum on the outside and 1/8 inch paneling on the inside, nothing in between, and a thermostat on that wall. So the wall was constantly cold. We'd turn the thermostat down to like 0, and it would still be very hot in there because it just couldn't keep up. But it was special to us. It was like I say, our first place, and we'd put a lot of time into it. When the kids came along, we needed to do something quick, and not being able to afford anything else, we started to build. So we involved Amos Christian, and I think, let's see, Gary Cornelius had just finished a Voc-Tech program in home construction then. And so we started to build out. We built a couple bedrooms, and then we built a living room, and we kind of built it into a 1,400 square foot house. And it was quite a project. I mean, I remember Amos, oh God, we were working on the roof, and we had scaffolds up, 4-foot scaffolds. We had them up too high, and then there was one plank across. So we were just about working on the ridge pole, and so Amos put a ladder on top of the one plank and walked up to the ridge. So he's up there, and his hammer is just out of reach. So he hangs on to the ladder and jumps it over to where he can reach the hammer. I remember him making wiring connections above the main. I mean, everything was hot. It was coming. The electricity was coming in right from the street, and he used to just scare me to death all the time. But it was amazing how he could make things work. So that's another part of my risk-taking behavior, I guess, is I learned a lot from him about how to do home construction. But we did everything there, from the block foundation to the rough framing, pulling the wire. I learned a great deal from Amos in that process, and ended up with a house that we could all fit in at the end of the day.
How long did you work with the 701 planners?
About a year and a half, as I recall.
Mm-hmm. And then where did you go?
Well, when I was a student, or while as a student, that organization that I'd spoken of, Waikatawe, was trying to do a number of things beyond recruiting. I mean, the recruiting was something that was significant in terms of bringing students in, because one, we wanted to have more educated Indian people, but two, the university was not very responsive to a handful of folks that often they referred to as radicals anyway. And if we had more people there, we would be able to influence the university to begin to look more broadly at course selection and the development of programs and so on. And so as we got more numbers, we were able to convince the university that they needed to do other kinds of things, like develop courses that would relate to the Indian languages in Wisconsin, and courses that incorporated elements of Indian history. I remember us talking to people, because we then began to affiliate with student organizations, Indian student organizations at the other campuses in the state, and Madison would not teach Indian languages. And their logic was that it was not academic. They could study remote Indian languages from South America someplace, but the languages in Wisconsin were not appropriate for academic research. We were looking at the need to preserve languages that we saw were very, very quickly waning, and it was a matter of pride. It was a matter of commitment that we engage in language preservation activities. And I think it was while we were doing that as students at GB that this was also evolving in the community. And so you were involved certainly very significantly in efforts at the community level. And Orville Clark, a professor at GB who was sympathetic to working with the students, had gone out on active a number of times to try to get the university engaged. And we finally, in 1974, came together in a way that we developed a program that kind of linked much of what we were doing at the university with some of the community's desires. And in July of 1974, we started the Oneida Language Project, and I had the good fortune to be selected by you and others to head that up.
And how long did this last, and how many people were involved in terms of the trainees?
In the first year, in '74, we had a $56,000 budget, and with that, we had a director and a secretary, and we had I believe it was four full-time trainees and one half-time trainee. we submitted a grant proposal for the following year, and our budget went up to $75,000. It was big stuff, and we added in a couple more. But then it was really in our third year where we built on the success that we had had in the first couple of years, and we gave presentations before the National Advisory Council on Indian Education. We were invited in 1976 to participate in the Festival of American Folklife in Washington, D.C., showcased to demonstrate how we had developed language activities, curricula, classroom teaching techniques, and so we had a week-long opportunity in Washington, D.C. to kind of educate America about how we were educating Oneidas in the language. And we used the opportunity in Washington to also meet with the then head of Indian Education, who was likewise very impressed with our approach, and who established a guaranteed, we were able to negotiate while we were there, a guaranteed 3-year funding package that was about $200,000 a year. And at that point, we were able to expand the program dramatically. I think at our apex, we had 18 tribal members in various stages of training, working in language development and building their own skills and proficiencies, as well as developing a K-8 curriculum. We did not yet have the tribal school, and so we were basically beta testing our curriculum in 5 of the surrounding school districts, and had negotiated with the schools for a release time for Indian students. The primary basis was 15 minutes a day, 5 days a week, so that they could have an opportunity for reinforcement and to make the language a more active and vital part of what they were doing. Now that was under Title VII, I think. Title V? Title IV. Title IV. It was Title IV of the Indian Education Act, which allowed us to develop innovative programs in support of Indian education. It was at the end of that 5 years, federal policy was changing relative to the preservation of Indian languages, and it then went to Title VII, which was bilingual education, which made it extremely difficult. By that time, I had gone back. I was academic staff at UW Green Bay, and let's see, Amelia Cornelius was heading the time that the transition to Title VII occurred. Julie Barton, who's been on the council for a very long time, was also one of the interim directors in that kind of transition period. But Title VII was difficult because it required the program to demonstrate its success not in the children's ability to use the language, but in their proficiency in English. And so you had to teach the kids in Oneida and then test them in English to be able to meet the federal standards, which was nonsensical. And while they were able to make it work for a time that way, obviously it was two different. The funding source was totally different than the desired outcome of the program, and eventually it had to change. So there were efforts. The tribe picked up where the feds had left off, and the program moved in yet other directions. But I'm very proud of what we were able to accomplish in the time that I was involved in it, that you were involved in it. I think we did some very good things, and a lot of the curricula that we developed during those years are still used today.
After you, did you leave the project then?
Middle of that 3-year funding package, as much as I was committed to language preservation, in my youth I seemed to have this feeling like if things became too predictable, that I needed to go bang my head against new walls. And so, 2 years to 3 years was kind of where I could really stay focused and enthused, encouraged to go in every day and do something new. I was still serving as president of the Oneida Nation Education Board, which was for a board that didn't have a lot of authority. But while maintaining that responsibility, I'd been offered a position at UWGB directing the, let's see, it was the pre-collegiate program and the educational opportunity program. And so I agreed to move on to that, and I did that for about 2 years. And during that time, wearing my president of the United Nations Education Board hat, I was a fortunate recipient of work that had been done by people over a lot of years, Norbert Hill and others, to bring the school here, to get the Bureau of Indian Affairs to support a school. And at that time, it made sense to really engage in that process. So we started moving with the school. We were notified in the middle of summer that we were going to be funded for a school starting in October. Of course, all the other schools in the area were starting well before that. The Bureau gave us a planning grant to prepare for that, but we did everything that we could do to get desks and books and resources from other school districts, and we tried to utilize the funds that we had for the planning grant primarily for operations, and we started the school in '79. While I was involved in that planning process and getting that up to speed, we decided to look more broadly at what the community needed. And at that point, we weren't looking at just the K-6 program, which was the first level of consideration that we were looking at. We elected to look at a full-blown kindergarten through junior college approach. And we didn't have anyone in the community at that point that had the credentials to work with the post-secondary education. And that was actually my motivation to go on to grad school. But I had worked at GB for a couple of years. I came back home, and while I was with the team in the schools planning, at that point we had hired Jerry M. Hill to be the primary planner, and he brought in some consultants, and it was an exciting time. I mean, developing an educational institution committed to the education of Oneida kids, and asserting that from that educational platform, able to represent and challenge the ideas of their people with all others. We were really committed to a strong academic program, but one that was culturally based, that had a significant influence in language. It was the original sophisticated, very solid academic institution. And so, our desire at that point was really highly motivating. And I figured if I was going to go to school and be prepared to do that I should do a good one.
And how long did you go there?
I had my family here. The kids were home. I was living in a dorm and batching it. And so I was motivated to get that completed absolutely as quickly as I could. And I actually finished my master's degree in 8 months. I went out in, let's see, it was, I think it was mid-September, and I finished up I set all my concluding courses based on the submission of papers rather than the taking of exams, so I didn't have to wait for exam week, and that got me done 2 weeks sooner. But, yeah.
And when you got back, what did you go into then?
Well, the community had not moved quite as quickly with the school's development as we'd originally proposed, and so there was not, at that point, the position that I had vacated had been filled, and there wasn't really anything that was immediately available to me. But also, when I had gone to grad school, I went there with two very different feelings. On one hand, I really had confidence that we as a community knew what it was that we needed to do, where we were going, and that to go on to grad school and receive a credential that would allow me to say basically what I'd been saying before, but to be heard differently because there's this Harvard master's degree behind me would mean that we could move things more quickly. On the other hand, I was pretty much scared to death because I had never been to New England. I'd never even considered an Ivy school, and there I was showing up in my corduroy sport jacket with my cleanest jeans and my cardboard box full of stuff to walk through a dormitory where a soiree was taking place with the dry sherry and cheese balls and the fires in the fireplaces at both ends of the gathering room. I didn't, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to deal with that dynamic. When I first got there, in some ways, it was the same feeling as I'd had going in the Marine Corps. It was like, okay, I did it to myself again. I've made this commitment. I'm here. I'm gonna see this through. But if I'd put a little more thought behind it, maybe I would have done something else. By the middle of the semester, what I began to appreciate was that a lot of things that I had seen as uniquely Oneida things, Oneida problems, Oneida opportunities, all of that, were things that are simply problems and opportunities that exist all over the world. I had the privilege of being in a class of 350 students representing 40-some states and 40-some countries. And we averaged 5 years post-baccalaureate experience in the field. So we literally had people from all over the world who had been working as practitioners for 5 years before coming back to school. And it was an incredibly challenging place, but it was challenging to the faculty, because the faculty could not be expert in all of the things that all of these people were expert in. And so in a lot of ways, many of the faculty became like traffic cops. They would just kind of channel into the experience of this or that one or whatever. But through that process, I began to learn that there were other ways of looking at things, and different cultures chose different approaches to resolving problems. And that, much of that could be brought back here. But also I began to learn, the old classic, it's not that I didn't know, it's that I didn't know I didn't know. I mean, that there was so much out there that was beyond my vision at the outset. I really began to realize in that couple months, I was going to be there to the surface on what that place could provide. I encouraged Jenny to apply. And she took a leave of absence from the school. She was a teacher in the school at that point, and accepted. And so I stayed in Boston with the Boston Indian. Actually, I didn't want to do that either. I was going to be a house husband for a while. But Jenny pursued her master's degree at Harvard also in teaching curriculum and learning environments, essentially prepared for curriculum development. And I was finishing a contract back here in Wisconsin doing some consulting for the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. And I got a phone call that the Boston Indian Council needed actually they'd gotten a program, but they hadn't done anything with it, and the feds were coming in 2 weeks to see the progress. And so when I came back, we had a telephone up on a window ledge, and the whole ledge was covered with these little these were all calls from the Boston Indian Council saying, "Would you be willing to come down and work with us on this?" So I actually did that. We pulled together a program and operated that program for a year, and then we came back home. He was hired into the school because she'd taken a leave of absence. The community still had not grown as quickly as the original plan, and so I looked for months for a position either or within the education community in the surrounding area, and wasn't successful. But the Boston Indian Council had offered me the position of senior planner before I left, and they agreed to hold it until Labor Day. So on Labor Day, old Indian, it was a telephone van that we bought back from Boston, and since I wasn't being helped, I had some time on my hands, so we painted it and made it look like something that it wasn't. But I ended up driving back out to Boston, working as the senior planner for the council, until I got a phone call from the tribe saying that they were interested in a new administrator for the school, and would I be willing to apply for that. And I was fortunate enough to be selected and came back and became the school administrator for about 4 years.
And how long did you work as administrator?
It was about, well, 3.5, 4 years, I think, and it was time to sort of do it again. I was actually the I went from that to the education director for the tribe, and I served in that position for about 2 years. After which I became an assistant chancellor at UW Green Bay. Very checkered past, couldn't keep a job. So I served as the assistant at Green Bay for about 3 years, and during that period I was going to actually complete my doctorate. And so I had diminished my responsibilities and was going to be commuting back and forth to Madison. And then one of the other hats that I'd worn during that period was serving on the American Indian Language and Culture Education Board, which was a state body. And it was originally established to deal with Indian language preservation efforts and so on, and it had moved the state to a point of recognition that this was something that was viable. And so I was chairing that body, and a good friend named Alan Caldwell of Menominee had been working within the Department of Public Instruction and attempting to move the school districts to implement that law. And the law provided for a 2-year time lag from the time that there was a requirement that the history, culture, and sovereignty of the tribes in Wisconsin be taught in all the public schools, and the time that they actually had to implement it. Alan was getting phone calls, threats. This was also during the time of the spearfishing controversy, and there was a lot of pretty ugly things going on. And when Alan actually got some death threats over putting curriculum in the schools, he elected to move on and went to Stevens Point and directed the Upward Bound program, I think. But I finally figured out what my track was going to be. And then it was just before the law was going to go into effect. I had worked with this closely, and I was encouraged to apply and take that position on. So I agreed to do that, and I was going to do that for 2 years. That was my commitment, but it meant working with all the school districts in the state, developing more curriculum, and working with the various organizations, both friend and foe, to try to get something meaningful in school for the kids. After 2 years of that, I was prepared to go back. I was going to kind of pick up on my course. I was going to go back to school, and that was when the tribe held the position of legislative affairs director. We were obviously becoming much more sophisticated in our approaches dealing with the federal government and with the state government. But there was also recognition that we needed to have staffing that to address those relationships with the other governments on a more regular basis. And it wasn't part of my goal at the time, but much of what I'd been doing over the preceding years, although in education, it also always dealt with the federal government. I'd served on a number of task forces. I'd been appointed by a couple presidents and a couple governors to committees, and it was something that I had some familiarity with. And so when the tribe offered that up, there I was at a decision point again. I pursued that and was selected. So I was legislative affairs director for 3 years, which then got me involved in a whole lot of things. Issues then around compacting, and the tribe was having problems with it had established like a 401k plan for its members, a retirement plan for its members. And there needed to be a legislative fix, and it took us 4 years to get that done, but we finally got that worked around so that the pensions of the tribal employees were not in jeopardy. It was also a time when it was much of what we were doing was more about defense than offense. There were a number of bills that were coming down consistently that would, if not negate, at least minimize the tribal government's jurisdictions and authorities. And with the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, there was much going on in the national political arena affecting gaming that could have been very devastating to us. Rick Hill was our chairman at the time I was hired, and with the support of the council, he kind of co-opted me from representing exclusively the tribe's positions to working with him on the national agenda in Indian gaming, trying to preserve the industry. And so that 3 years, the first two of that 3 years, was extremely challenging, bouncing coast to coast. We were in every hot spot in gaming in the country. We were in Idaho, where I think you've been out there. Their bingo hall was built like a fort. I mean, a very big concrete bunker. The issues in California were extremely hot and heavy at that point. Working through the Inouye-McCain process and working with 25 tribal leaders, 3 attorneys general, and 3 governors to try to resolve the questions affecting Indian gaming was quite challenging, and that we prevailed on virtually all the issues was also very rewarding. But then we moved from gaming, I moved then from gaming as a national agenda much more to the tribe's specific issues, the change in administration. And we were looking at the next round of compact negotiations, trying to lock something in with a governor who then was committed to negotiate with us much more like a business executive would negotiate with a union. And it was going to be, I win, you lose. There was no willingness on the part of the administration to look at the possibilities for expansion or growth that would benefit the state and us. Instead, it was about maintaining control and holding down the industry. And the process was difficult and frustrating. But at the end of the day, we ended up with another compact that seemed to serve us well over the next 5 years. After serving as legislative affairs person for 3 years, then there was a desire on the part of the council to change leadership in the position of general manager. And when I saw the position description come up group-wise, it took me about that long to click that away and laugh hysterically. It's kind of like, I remember when Bill Clinton was looking for a legal counsel, and they were saying the problem was not only finding somebody who was smart enough to do it, but also dumb enough to take it. And it occurred to me that there was a certain correlation there. The position of general manager is one that can be very, very complex. And I did not personally see that in my career path at all. But it was another one of those things that I elected to take on. And technically, I guess, I've now been the general manager for 5 years, although 3 of those 5 were very directly involved as the GM, working with the issues, dealing with budget deficits and a lot of organizational challenges. But then under the last council, chaired by Jerry Danforth, I was placed on a special assignment to work on the issues of land claims, and that's where I still find myself today.
That brings us up to today.
It does.
Any areas you want to elaborate on at this point that we feel we may have neglected?
I feel like I've probably bored you to death with all these meanderings down memory lane.
Well, you got to remember the audience, though. Again, I go back to what here. I equate this to be like the WPA.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody's going to really feel the effect of the situation right now. But I think in time, the impact is going to be much like the WPA stories. They're going to be really a treasure trove. So what may seem to be the ordinary right now, I think is going to be something of really significant things for our future of our people. So that's the way I look at. I don't think any story that any one of them have told is a boring situation, because it's a unique situation, and the history of our people is just so fascinating. It's intriguing to hear all of these things. I just feel it so beneficial.
I bet having the opportunity to hear everyone's story. I mean, it must present a very different view of the community, combining all the individual vignettes. I think, we all are members of the community. We all are, in our own way, certainly proud and committed to, proud of being Oneida and committed to the advancement of the Oneida community. But I think that manifests itself in so many different ways. I don't know if there's really much more that I can add. I think my life, obviously, starting off in South Bend, Indiana, who would have figured that I would have been doing what I'm doing up here? But all of my adult life has really been committed to the tribe. And one of the things that I've told people is that, being at the university, having headed academic programs for kids that are, kind of marginal, and helping prepare them and getting them involved and getting them successful. One of the things that you always teach someone is how to set a plan, a life plan. Look at the goals. Where do you want to be 10 years out? How do you get there? And one of the things that I never did was exactly that. I mean, I could train people in how to do this, but I always found myself moving to whatever it was that the tribe needed next. And so my life has gone in all of these different twists and turns. It's gone in a lot of different directions, but all of them in their own way have been very different. They've been very rewarding. We've dealt with so many challenges. We've come so far. I mean, from the days in Chicago corners with the cows lined up next to the building and the wind whistling through the single pane windows and all the stuff that was that to where we are today. I look around and I'm really in awe of what we've accomplished. I think we've set a good foundation for the future. There's going to be a lot more challenges ahead, and I hope our young people are prepared to take that up.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.